Here's a fun little story about something I learned when I didn't want to get my first car. Let me explain. Being on the older side of Generation X, I was in high school in the mid 1980s. Our movies were the John Hughes teen angst comedies like 16 Candles and Pretty in Pink, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and The Breakfast Club. Except I didn't grow up in the posh suburbs of Chicago like in those movies. My neighborhood didn't feature wealthy parents who gave their kids cars, and even the poorer kids knew how to thrift shop and make stunning outfits like magic out of odds and ends tossed out by said wealthy families. Our reality was more like what you saw in movies like Fame, only without all the spontaneous singing and dancing. Inner city movies of the 1980s really did feature a lot of spontaneous parades and singing and dancing, now that I think about it. But yeah, we were kids in the inner city doing the best we could with what we had. You know, I've told this story several times over the years, but until I sat down just now to tell you, I didn't realize that it is in part a story about generation gaps. My parents straddled the dividing line between the so-called silent generation and the baby boomers. If you were to ask them, I'm not sure what movies they would pick to represent their formative years, but given that my father grew up in the same city I did, I kind of think that American Graffiti or Grease likely painted a reasonable representation of growing up in the late 50s and early 60s. Again, probably with less spontaneous singing and dancing. Of course, those movies came out in the mid-70s, so what do I know? But I bring up these movies to highlight some other differences between our generations that never previously occurred to me were relevant to this story. It's kind of bizarre that I never thought of this story before from their point of view, but maybe now that I'm older, I'm identifying more with them than I am with myself in this story. Anyway, my father and I are alike in a kind of weird way that also highlights our differences. The things that my friends and I gravitated towards as a symbol of freedom and simply a dazzlingly exciting innovation was computers. And I'm in no way suggesting this was typical of your average Gen Xer. Well, yeah, now that I think about it, it probably was. But in those heady high school days, when the public schools first started teaching computer programming, even in the gang-riddled inner city, there were a few of us who just had the magic touch with motherboards and CPUs and expansion slots and lines of code. Math nerd that I was one of those guys. Whereas during my father's high school days, the holy grail was cars. Cars were still in their purer form in those days, physical machines that you tuned and customized with wrenches and screwdrivers and grease and raw brute force. Working on those beasts meant really getting in there and getting your hands dirty, but the results were so physical, so real world. If you tuned the engine right, it would purr like a big cat. Get it wrong and it would belch and cough and sputter and die like a big cat with tuberculosis. And my father, I learned much later in my life, was one of those guys who could just look at a machine and figure out how it was supposed to work and what it was supposed to do. He had a gift and a passion for cars like I had for computers. So one day, when I was 16, my father came to me and made me an offer. He said this was the same offer his father had made to him. In our state at that time, car insurance was expensive, but young drivers could get the price reduced if they took a driver's ed course. These courses weren't mandatory in our state back then, and a teenager's auto insurance would be much cheaper if they were on their parents' policy than if they got a policy on their own. And what my father offered was something along the lines of, if I wanted to get a car, they would let me get my own insurance via their policy. I think he might even have offered to pay for my driver's ed class, but I do know that taking driver's ed was a condition for getting onto their policy. All I'd have to do is get a car, of course, pay for my share of the insurance premium, and the like. It actually was a pretty good deal because, of course, a kid could get a newspaper route or work at the local pizzeria and save up enough money to buy a used car and pay for gas and oil changes and tune-ups and all that. And by being on their parents' insurance, why, that would make it so much more affordable. And what teenager wouldn't want to spend their weekends working on their car when they weren't working on their newspaper routes or making change at the corner store? Oh, right. Me. That's who. What must have been a super enticing offer for my father back in the day looked to me like just a big old obligation. Instead of having my weekends free to read books and listen to records, I'd be clanging away at my car just to keep it going, or driving my sibling to some event that my parents didn't want to have to take care of themselves. Instead of having my nights free to go to my friend's house, where they had one of those brand new Apple II Plus computers, and we could spend hours writing programs and chatting on computer bulletin boards and hacking software copy protection. Yeah, we were real hooligans back in those days. I'd need a job so that I could pay for gas and all those other expenses. I thanked my father for the offer, and then I didn't pursue it. I genuinely appreciated it, but even so, I didn't want it. The fact that I didn't follow up at all must have surely surprised my father. Again, what teenage boy wouldn't want a car of their very own? Never mind that almost none of my friends at that time had cars, and public transportation was just fine for getting from my neighborhood to school. But what I didn't know was that my parents didn't make this offer just to be nice. They had an ulterior motive. You see, I was taking math classes 2 evenings per week at a nearby university instead of at my school. Math nerd, remember? And we didn't have anybody to carpool with. And public transportation wasn't as easy heading out to the campus, so it fell to my parents to drive me on those evenings. A half hour there and a half hour back. Or maybe it was only 20 minutes each way, but the classes were 2 hours long, so do they sit there for 2 hours or drive back home to get some stuff done, and then drive back out to pick me up? All told, that's like an extra 2.5 to 2 hours of driving on those days, and they were kind of done with it. So they were motivated for me to get myself a car. I wasn't. So a few weeks later, my parents came to me with a new offer. They would pay for my insurance, and they would pay for my driver's ed classes. All I had to do was get myself a car. I still didn't want to have to raise the money to buy a car, but at this point, an idea had occurred to me. Didn't my great-grandmother own a car when she had died? Did anybody do anything with that car? Well, no, it turned out nobody had done anything about that car. Her house and her car stayed put in Florida, while my grandparents were still working in another state halfway between Florida and where we lived. Their plan was to move into her old house once they retired, but they hadn't any plans for the car, so it was just sitting there. Again, my parents were motivated, and I was not. So since I had asked the question, they talked it over with my grandparents, who in the end very kindly gifted me the car, although I would have to pay to travel down there to retrieve it, and there were some other expenses as well. But when all was said and done, I ended up with a car that was about 2 years older than I was. I got my driver's license, and all I had to do was get a job working a few hours a week as a janitor at a local nursing home, and that covered my gas. Now, as I tell this story today, it occurs to me that a lot of this really is about the differences in priorities between the generations. My kids have been nowhere near as interested in computers as I was, maybe a programming class in high school just for kicks, but they take computers for granted. Hell, they are carrying a more powerful computer in their pocket than any computer I learned how to program on. But likewise, my generation took cars for granted. I'm curious as to what the next generation down the line will take for granted that is still kind of new or interesting for my kids. Will it be AI or digital agents? Will it be the benevolent dictatorship of our robot overlords? But there is another theme to this story. This wasn't a case of me outwitting my parents or anything like that. It taught me a lesson, though, about power dynamics. As a general rule, in any situation between parties, power doesn't necessarily reside with the party with more resources. Like in this case, my parents clearly had far more resources than I did. Instead, power typically rests more with the party that is more willing to do without than the other party. My parents wanted me to drive more than I wanted to drive, so they had to offer more concessions than I did. In a romantic relationship, to take another example, if the partners are not both equally committed to making the relationship work, the person who is more committed is the person who has to compromise more often. It's a lesson that has come up over and over again in my personal life, and it is also a dynamic that you can see at play every time you go to work or read a newspaper or... Wait a minute, does anybody read newspapers anymore? Well, you know what I mean. Just some food for thought from the INRIS Files. Thanks for stopping by. and we'll see you next time.